sun pouring down in the strawberry sky. Tall grass dancing down by the St. John's riverside. And I can see Maggie running through the fields full of wild. A free spirit living a beloved life.
I'd like to announce our guest tonight, which will be appearing by Zoom. First, we have Dr. Paul Robinson, who is not only a medical doctor, but he's also a Ph.D. He practiced emergency medicine and pediatric emergency medicine for 4 decades. During his career, he witnessed some of the impacts of a changing climate on his patients' health. He serves on the advisory committee of Florida Clinicians for Climate Action. In addition, he is a media liaison for the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health. We also have a second speaker, Carol Lindsey. Carol is a family nurse practitioner. As a steering committee member and co-advocacy chair of Florida Clinicians for Climate Action, she advocates for policies promoting climate, health, and equity. She's also an active member of the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments, an organization involved in educating nurses and others in the public regarding the effects of climate change. Her career includes over 40 years of nursing and public health experience. Carol also served as 30 years as an active duty commissioned officer in the United States Public Health Service. So we have some very incredible speakers tonight, and to bring home from us, most of us know some of the impacts on our health and on our community's health of climate change, but I'm sure they're going to give us a lot of information that we don't know yet. So welcome, speakers.
As you were told, Carol and I represent Florida Clinicians for Climate Action, an organization of nurses and physicians from across the state that educate and advocate regarding the impact of climate change on health, both today and in the future. Our national organization, the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health, published this slide, and what it shows is the major impacts of climate change on various regions of the country. So you can see in the southeastern corner, the southeastern United States, including Florida, the impacts from the left top there are air pollution, disasters, mental health changes, heat and heat waves, vectors of diseases, and there we're predominantly talking about ticks and mosquitoes, and waterborne diseases. In 2005, I was working in a trauma center in a region of the country, in a city that was a major relocation area for Hurricane Katrina refugees. And these people were bereft. They had lost their homes. They had lost loved ones or didn't know where they were, didn't know if they were alive, didn't obviously have a medical home, didn't know where to go for help. And, I remember one woman who was an insulin-dependent diabetic who didn't have insulin, hadn't tried to, or didn't know how to find any, and came in with a blood sugar of about 400. She was not acidotic. She was quite sick. We turned her around and wrote her a script, and hopefully that changed that. But then Hurricane Rita rolled right over our city and terrorized those people all over again. Subsequent storms, even minor rainstorms, can have that impact on people who have suffered a major disaster. A subsequent study showed that women like her, who were refugees, were more than 78 times as likely to attempt suicide as people from the same region of the country and the same gender who had not been so impacted. So this kind of disaster has significant mental health impacts, especially on children, and they can be long lasting. This slide, let's look at disasters historically. This slide shows by 4 decades the increase in the number of billion, with a B, dollar disasters in the United States. You can see in the top left the time period 1980s, from 80 to 89, there were 29 total billion-dollar events in the United States. And we're talking heat waves, droughts, major storms, hurricanes, and cold episodes as well. And the cost was, say, there were 3 per year on average. Jump to the 2010s, 2010 to 2019, and there were 123 events, more than a 400% increase, or 13 per year, and the cost went up by 400%. Go all the way to the right, and you can see that also the carbon dioxide concentration in our atmosphere increased from 345 parts per million in the 80s to 411 parts per million in 2017 to 21 average. It is today 417 approximately. You can chart, as they have here, using data from NOAA's environmental information section, which is available online. You can chart the temperature over time from 1980 to 2021 against carbon dioxide concentration, and you see they parallel each other quite nicely. You can also chart carbon dioxide level in purple against the number of billion-dollar disasters per year, and they parallel each other. And you can chart the global temperature change over 40 years against the billion-dollar disasters, and they parallel each other. If you look at the gray chart on the left, this is the amount of carbon dioxide that we humans are kicking into our atmosphere every year. And you can see the rapid rise of the amount of carbon dioxide. At the top right of that little chart, it shows a dip in 2020 due to COVID-19. And people were at the time saying, oh, look, we've turned a corner. Well, no, we didn't turn any corners, because the next year it jumped up by 6%. Last year, we humans put 37 gigatons of carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. A gigaton is 2.2 trillion pounds, or the weight of 10,000 fully loaded aircraft carriers, and we kicked 37 of those into our atmosphere last year. Chart in the middle shows that the culprits are predominantly coal still, in red, oil in purple at 12 gigatons, and methane gas, or they call it natural gas, at 8 gigatons per year. The lowest little line there is production of concrete. And the chart on the right shows the countries. China is way in the lead now, having overtaken the United States in about 2006. 11 gigatons, the United States 5 gigatons, and India rapidly rising to match the emissions of the European Union. The big three in terms of production of carbon dioxide or release of carbon dioxide in the United States: transportation, electric power, and industry, and they account for 77%. Another disaster that we don't usually think about in terms of our state is wildfires. You can see from the map that wildfires in dark brown and orange are predominantly a Western United States phenomenon, except for one state in the Union, and that's us. The prediction for the future for our state is not wet season, dry season. It's drought followed by deluge. And in 2016 to 2017, we had the worst drought in Florida in 103 years. Between January and June of that year, there were more than 2,000 wildfires across the state of Florida, and we took over from California during that 6-month period as the wildfire capital of the United States. Okay, now I want to talk about heat and heat waves. This is a chart of heat indices, or heat index. And heat index is the feel-like temperature. It's a combination of ambient temperature and relative humidity. And it is taken, by the way, in the shade, not in the sun. Most people don't know that. This chart is used by the National Weather Service and by NOAA, and it breaks down the risk to human beings of major heat illness depending on the heat index in the outside. So in the yellow, which they call caution, is from a heat index of 80 to 90. And if the heat index is that and there is prolonged exposure or exercise or activity, work outside, then there is a risk of fatigue. In the gold area from 91 to 103, this is called extreme caution, and that translates to there is a risk of heat cramps, heat exhaustion, or even heat stroke. In the orange area from 105 to 124, the risk is now likelihood with exposure or activity of cramps or heat exhaustion. And in the deep red, highly likely to produce heat stroke. In ascending order of severity, heat cramps are just what they sound like, cramps in the arms and legs because of exposure to heat and loss of sodium due to sweating, loss of salt. Heat exhaustion is more severe. It usually involves some confusion. People are often nauseated. They can have abdominal cramps. They sometimes have arm and leg cramps too. Their skin is usually wet. They're usually still sweating. Their temperature is usually normal or slightly above normal. Heat stroke is the color of a different horse. It is a medical emergency. People with heat stroke always have significant brain dysfunction, either delirium, seizures, but most often like coma. Their skin is hot and dry and their temperature is at least 104. The Union of Concerned Scientists predicted, this was from about 3 years ago, that by the middle of this century, there would be a marked increase in the number of days in which the heat index would meet or exceed 105. And this is the prediction for the Florida's 13th congressional district, which is where I live. The prediction is 77 days by 2050. The 1 day on the left is the average for the 20th century. And the 47 days on the right is what we can maybe hold it to if we limit the warming of our planet to a total of 2 degrees centigrade. The next I'm going to talk about is data that I have compiled. It became obvious last summer, pretty early on in June, that we were seeing heat that we hadn't seen before. So I began compiling data using some local WeatherStem information. And I was compiling 5 parameters for every minute of every day. So time of day, relative humidity, ambient temperature, heat index, and wet bulb globe temperature. And we'll talk about that last one in a minute. And the results were startling. So by the time I was halfway through, I started looking at previous years as well. So I now have 6 years of data. On the left at the bottom, 2017, the green bar is June, blue is July, light green is August, and light blue is total. Then the same for 2018, 19, 20, 21, and 22. And you can see the rise in the total number of days in which the heat index equaled or exceeded 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Remember that the prediction was 77 days per year by 2050. Well, that bar all the way to the right is 74 days. So after I got that, I decided to count September, and there were 12 days in September in which the heat index was at or above 105, 86 days in 4 months. So we've already blown past the prediction for 3 decades from now. I did this one because I really wanted to do a 3-dimensional slide, and I'd never done one before, but this is just another way of looking at 105 or greater or 110 or greater. And you can see the rise of both from 2018, when there were no days that reached 210, to 2022, when 61 days reached or exceeded 110. Another way of looking at the increase in heat is to look at the maximum heat index. And you can see the rise of that bar over that graph over time. The hottest heat index that we recorded in my city last year was 127. If you think back to the weather chart of heat index, that's in the deep red zone, in which heat stroke is said to be highly likely. Just to give you a feel for heat stroke, I've treated maybe 80 people for heat exposure and 3 for heat stroke. And the last one was a 17-year-old boy who was rolled in by ambulance on a stretcher with his football pads and his football uniform still in place. He had been called in as a heat exhaustion. He wasn't. When he rolled through the door, he was comatose. His skin was hot to the touch, and his internal temperature was 107. So we cut him out of his uniform, and we did the standard first aid for heat stroke or heat exhaustion, which is strip him, wet him, turn on the fans, and put ice packs in the neck and the armpits and the groin. And it had no effect whatsoever. So we had to get very aggressive, and we ended up putting in a central line, intubating him, and the nurses put a nasogastric tube in his stomach. We were putting ice saline in his bloodstream. We were putting ice water in his stomach, and we were putting iced oxygen in his lungs. And after an hour and 20 minutes, he did turn. And when he left the department, he was 1015. He was still comatose. I saw him the next morning. He was fine. He was very subdued emotionally, but he was fine. Heat stroke is 100% fatal if untreated, and it's 30 to 80% fatal if treatment is delayed, as it had been in this young man's case. Another way of looking at the risk to human beings of heat is to look at the wet bulb globe temperature, which is a composite of 5 measurements. Again, humidity and heat, ambient temperature, but also solar radiation, cloud cover, and wind speed. It is taken in sun, not shade. It's actually a better way of predicting, but most people are not familiar with it, so we don't talk about it as much. However, a lot of the charts that, for example, the NCAA uses are based on wet bulb globe temperature. Another way of saying that, it's a stress temperature. And again, you can see the growth in the number of days with a wet bulb globe temperature of 90 and of 92. The highest wet bulb globe temperature I saw last year in our city was 94.2. And the reason that I show you this is because 95 is fatal for all humans. And it doesn't matter who you are. And it doesn't matter if you're under a tree with fans running, because the human body simply cannot deal with that combination of weather. It doesn't happen instantly, of course. You know, it might take 2.5 hours for a marathon runner who's acclimated. Nobody's ever going to do the experiment, so I can't tell you exactly, but it is a fatal temperature, and I never expected to see it. I looked at the 2 weather stem sites in Sarasota for the time of summer when I got the highest temperatures in our city. And the one at Glen Ridge at Palmer Ranch, the highest heat index I saw was 119, and the highest wet bulb globe temperature I saw was 93.8. Still not quite as high as us, but pretty high. And again, that's just 2 weeks of looking, not the whole summer. This is where I usually get on my soapbox and say, we don't have to take this lying down. We can protect our citizens. We can protect our communities. A lot of fairly simple ways, with trees, with green roofs, reflective surfaces, with cooling stations and hydration stations. And we need to start yesterday. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Carol now. Thank you.
Righty, great. Well, good evening. Thank you all for having us here tonight. It's very exciting, being very proactive of you all to find out more information about this. As you know, I'm Carol Lindsey and a family nurse practitioner. Tonight, I'm going to be talking to you about climate change and its impacts on health related to air pollution, water quality, including harmful algal blooms, red tide, vector-borne diseases, and some information on what the Department of Defense is doing and how all of this affects veterans. So first, I'll talk to you about air pollution and poor air quality. And you heard Dr. Robinson talk about the fires that are expected in Florida in the future and that we've had in the past. And of course, there's fires out west. All of this contributes to air pollution and poor air quality. Some of the fires from the west even come as far as Florida and come into our atmosphere. There's also air pollution that's caused by burning of fossil fuels like coals or electricity for our factories, gas for our cars, gas stoves also, or anything run on natural gas, which really isn't a clean gas, as they say, because it has methane in it. This also contributes to air pollution. And even our landfills, they release methane into the air, which is a greenhouse gas. So all of this and other things can contribute to poor air quality, smoking additionally. Now, heat also, because heat waves, as the slide indicates, they're caused by stationary domes of hot air. And when they're stationary, then you have no air movement going on, and this is actually trapping the pollutants that are in the air. And a combination of pollution, heat, and sunshine can create something called ground level ozone, smog, which you may have seen if you're stuck in traffic and you see some vapor coming from the cars. Also, if agricultural workers or yourselves, if you've worked outside in some fields, the fertilizer that's been used on the ground can become gases with the combination of heat and the sunshine. And that can come up into the air and that can be inhaled, and it's got contaminants in it. In fact, some studies have shown that people that work in the agricultural industry, this inhalation of these contaminants can cause kidney damage along with other things. And there's thousands of deaths in the US each year and millions of cases of respiratory conditions. Of course, you're breathing this in. So it can cause issues with this, plus other body functions. And there's been 5 million cases of deaths in the whole world from air pollution. And cars and lawnmowers, anything that's powered by gas can also release fumes into the air and contribute to air pollution. So the health impacts from this air pollution when it's let out into the air are these small particles that can contribute to air, and this can lead to health issues like respiratory diseases and allergies. It can lead to cardiac disease because the heart is already working harder if there's some issues with your heart. And you're inhaling these contaminants. It can lead to lung issues, including cancer, because our lungs are very vascular. And when we breathe in this air and there's very tiny contaminants in it, this can get into our bloodstream through our lungs. It can lead to skin diseases. It can lead to anxiety and mental health issues, because when people are trying to breathe in contaminated air, it may stress them out or they may be getting sick from it. So it can cause anxiety. And also, air pollution can, the way that they do research and they follow data on air pollution, this research and these investigations, these are used to support the nation's air quality standards that are under the Clean Air Act in order to provide public health information and to improve the public health. And this is through the Environmental Protection Agency. And air quality pollution, air pollution, it can harm all of us. But people that are more vulnerable at greater risk, including are these different populations that are listed. For example, elderly people, because usually they already have some kind of compromised system because the organs have gotten a little older. They may have diabetes or they respiratory issue or cardiac issue already, which increases their vulnerability. Children, because their systems aren't mature enough to handle this, and children tend to be playing outside and breathing this air more. People with cardiovascular disease or lung disease already, they're compromised, so this makes them more vulnerable. People who work or exercise outside, people of low socioeconomic status, or even people of color, because usually they live in real estate that is close to manufacturing plants or to highways because it's cheaper real estate to rent or to own. And also pregnant women. There's been studies that show that if they're exposed to air pollution, this can lead to premature labor, preterm births, and low birth weight babies. And so there are some climate solutions for air pollution. If you happen to have some kind of respiratory disease or cardiac disease, diabetes, you may want to check airnow.gov for your specific area, and it can show you how bad the pollution is. You, of course, want to avoid exercise in high traffic areas or places that are prone to air pollution. Luckily, we don't have too many factories in this area. In Sarasota also, I used to live in Sarasota, Bradenton, so I'm familiar with the geography there. You want to use less energy at your home, walk, bike, mass transit, the bus system, or carpool. Instead of using gas-powered electric or lawn car equipment, care equipment, you may want to use electricity. Don't allow anyone to smoke indoors. Try to avoid secondhand smoke because that is definitely an air pollutant also. And you can check out the Healthy Air campaign. This is run by the American Lung Association, and they advocate for federal laws and policy to slash air pollution. And then water quality impacts. As our oceans warm up, this increased water vapor in the air. And when this water vapor passes over land, or it combines with a storm, some kind of severe weather system that's already existing, there's increased precipitation. There's more rain that's caused by this. And all this rain can lead to more flooding. And when you have flooding, this can possibly, if you have sewer lines, like what happened in Fort Lauderdale a few years ago, they had a sewer line break. They had floodwaters in their downtown area and in some neighborhoods, and there was raw sewage that was floating in it. You know, there's also snakes, and you don't know what's in the water that can contribute to increased issues when there's flooding. And then we have harmful algal blooms also, which you guys are familiar with. I didn't know that you all were being affected in Sarasota. I saw that there is some red tide up in the Indian Rivers place near Clearwater. But what can happen with this is when it rains, when you have flooding, industrial waste or fertilizer can be sent into the water, and that can contribute to the red tide. And when you have, going back to the floods, when you have contamination in the water that can affect your drinking water with bacteria, viruses, or protozoa, thank goodness we don't really have cholera in our country, but we do have some of these other things that are listed. And basically they can lead to diarrheal illnesses. If you have infected wounds, if you have open wounds and you go into this water, your wounds can become infected, and you can have mental stress by all of this. If you get sick from contaminated water, if you have flooding that is hurting your home, your work, the roads that you travel on, this can contribute to mental health stress. And then again, back to these harmful algal blooms, they're called, or HAB, blue-green algae, and red tide, which again, like I mentioned, you all are very familiar with. If all the factors are right, like the water is warm, you have a certain amount of salinity in it, and also there's nutrients that are there, like nitrogen and phosphorus, then you may have red tide. And again, when you have industrial or agricultural runoff, that is food for these red tides. And that just will exacerbate them and make them much worse. And the health impacts from harmful algal blooms, probably some of you can speak about them yourself because you've experienced them. When I lived on Longboat Key, I remember that when I went outside during a red tide, that my eyes were watering, I was sneezing. It can cause respiratory irritation, shortness of breath. just the things, if you breathe in this stuff, it's going to possibly irritate your throat also. It can cause skin irritation if you go into it, and it can exacerbate respiratory conditions that you may have, like asthma or COPD. So once again, for poor air quality, water quality, who's being harmed? All of us can be harmed. But for flooding, a lot of times it's first responders that are going into that flood. Hopefully they have personal protective equipment. And people living in flooded areas, of course, they're the ones that are going to be affected. And for poor quality, water quality, it's going to affect the fishermen in that area. They're not going to be able to sell their fish. There's a lot of dead fish on the beach. Restaurants, businesses near those affected areas, people aren't going to want to go sit in there if it's bothering their eyes and their breathing. Persons that live near these affected areas, and also animals. It's going to bother the animals, your dogs, if you take them walking on the beach. Anybody that's trying to go to the beach could be affected, or in the immediate area. So again, some of this is common sense. You don't want to go into flooded waters because you don't know what's in there, obviously. You don't want to go to areas with harmful algal blooms. It's good if your city can control storm runoff. There are all kinds of ways. The EPA has all kinds of information on this online. It's a good idea to plant trees near the water, because that will create shade and maybe decrease the water temperature. And some of these other ideas that are on here, to mulch or compost grass or yard waste, and to maybe blow or sweep the fertilizer back into the grass if it gets into paved areas. Or in Miami, what they did was, I'm from Miami-Dade County, they encouraged people not to fertilize their plants during the rainy season, to help with the runoff, like into Biscayne Bay here. And there's a lot of other climate solutions. These are just a few. And then we have vector-borne diseases that are increasing with increasing heat from climate change. And a vector, in case some of you aren't familiar, it's a type of transmit, some kind of animal or insect that can transmit a pathogen, a parasite, or disease to another person. They carry it with them. And the ones that we're talking about are mostly mosquitoes and ticks in Florida, but also fleas. Fleas can cause plague, but fortunately, as far as I know, there haven't been any incidents of this. So this is from CDC. And as you can see from these graphs, from 2004 to 2016, Florida mosquito-borne and tick-borne diseases have almost tripled the amount of them. And the green bar represents mosquito-borne diseases, and the orange or red bar represents tick-borne diseases. So they are increasing. And the reason they're increasing is because the mosquitoes and the ticks, they love the hot weather. In fact, it increases their metabolism, and they get hungrier and they bite more. It increases the territory that they can go into. Places are getting hotter that weren't hot before. So the mosquitoes are able to travel to new areas to live, and ticks also, and reproduce. There's also longer seasons. It's staying hot longer. Look how hot it is in February and March. In Miami, it's been 90 degrees sometimes in the last couple of months, and probably in your areas too, very hot. And then we have more increased precipitation going on, more rain. And in these puddles, and if we leave canisters or any type of equipment out in the yard that can have water in it, then the mosquitoes will go and they'll lay their larvae in it. So this increases the number of mosquitoes also. And again, any of us are at risk for this, but especially children, because they need to be monitored. They need to be told to take care of themselves, not to go outside when the mosquitoes are bad or when the ticks are bad. Elderly, again, because our systems may be more compromised, because we may have some diseases as we've gotten older. And the chronically ill, because of the compromised immunity. And then if you think about it, also people that hike or camp, people who work outside, like park rangers, or people that are working in the grass or in the forest, and people who lack adequate housing. may be more susceptible to these vector-borne diseases. Some of these things also you probably know, obviously, to use insect repellent and to cover your body as much as possible and to wear hats when you're hiking because of the ticks that might be on the trees or the leaves. You can treat your boots, pants, socks, tents with permethrin. Maybe you did that when you were active duty in the military also. You want to control ticks and fleas on pets, but these, it depends. The ticks that are causing some of the diseases are more like from deer ticks. And you want to make sure if you do find ticks that you remove them properly. And you can go online to see some videos on how to do it because you want to make sure that you remove the head of the tick. And in your neighborhoods, hopefully they're spraying things that are safe and not polluting the air, but that can also protect you from mosquitoes and ticks. And of course, avoid standing water in your yards or your areas. So now I'm going to go into briefly too about climate change and how it affects veterans. Well, as far as homeless veterans, if we have hurricanes, we have severe weather, we have flooding, wildfires, and other things that affect people outside mostly. This can affect our homeless veterans. And 13% of the homeless are veterans in some of the information that I found. And as far as the Department of Defense, I'm going a little bit out of order of these bullets. When we have extreme drought or flooding where the military are engaged in theater or warfare, this can compromise, for example, the water supply in that area, and this can affect the military directly. In fact, if the enemy has access to more water in these dry areas, they may use it as a tool to negotiate or to put our service in more of a detrimental situation. Also, there hurricanes, heat waves, sea level rise may affect some of our bases in our country and our bases overseas, especially if they're near the coast. This may threaten both military and civilian infrastructure. And there's wars that have been fought over fossil fuels when we were in the Middle East. And there may be wars in the future as drought worsens, because drought's pretty bad, especially in a lot of countries where we may be fighting more for water, for access to water. So all these different kinds of things can affect the military. And I want you to know as veterans that I looked this up, and you may be aware of this also, that the Department of Veteran Affairs has a climate action plan in place, and it outlines what the VA's response is to the projected impacts from climate change. With the bottom line, they want to ensure sustained operations to provide care to you all. The Department of Air Force, they released a climate action plan actually last October, and this defines how it's going to prepare for operational capability, increase resiliency, and they want to be able to mitigate future climate impacts through specific and measurable objectives and key results. And probably the other services are doing that too. And additionally, there is a veterans organization, and it's called Operation Free. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's a coalition of veterans and national security experts who recognize climate change and our energy dependency can pose serious threats to the U.S. and national security. And they're trying to push for policies in our government in order to avoid these possible future problems. So you may want to look that up. And, we're veterans. I'm a veteran. I'm considered a veteran too. I'm a retired colonel or captain from the Public Health Service. And we represent, as veterans, we represent the full political, socioeconomic, religious, racial, and ethnic spectrums. We work in every sector and industry, and we live in every state. And we want to contribute. That's part of what they encourage in us when we were active duty. So we can really make a difference out there. And you already are. You're learning about what's going on. And you talked about that petition that you all are encouraging your colleagues to sign for clean water. So I applaud you all for asking Dr. Paul Anderson and myself here to learn a little bit more about climate change. The Florida Clinician for Climate Action, we mostly focus on the health impacts because we're clinicians, but we need to work on this politically also. So I hope that this will help you all in some way. And I know Dr. Anderson does also, and that you get involved in some of the solutions for climate change. So thank you.
We'll tell you about a couple of other things that we do, which you'd be interested in, I think. We plant microforests. So we've planted probably 10,000 trees in the last 3 or 4 years. And we're still working on that project. So if you know somebody that needs a microforest, get in touch. And we also do political action. Dennis, grab that bumper sticker where I could show them our bumper sticker about Piney Point. Dennis, bring it up where we can show it to our speakers. And what was that, Rich?
A climate voter. Oh yeah, I'm a climate voter.
Can you see this?
What's it say?
Yes, nice.
Yeah.
And we have one, be a climate voter, or a climate voter. And so we're taking this political action, and one question I'll start out with, what can we do to have our governor and legislatures pay attention to climate change? We have a governor we now have a governor that acknowledges climate change, but he doesn't want to do anything about it. He wants to have Florida be resilient, but that's not going to stop the increased carbon that's going into the air. What does your group suggest that we all be doing at this point?
Dr. Robinson?
Yeah, I think the answer is to advocate in the offices in Tallahassee, both at the state level and at the federal level, and that is something that we engage in. Not as often as we should, however, and I think we all should be doing that. After all, they work for us. They are our elected representatives. And, you know, they're not going to listen to one person's voice, but if they hear the same thing from lots of people, they do pay attention to that. So we can be writing letters to the editor, we can write op-eds, and we can advocate in their offices. But numbers count.
We just had a good letter to the editor just to inform you that encouraging people to sign the petition to have a constitutional amendment to a constitutional right to have clean water in Florida.
Excellent.
So that was we put that out in our notice, and particularly being a veteran, we encourage you to join our group and work with us because we're all working on the same problem.
Exactly, and work locally too, like you are. That's very important. And call, if you can't write emails or if you don't have time for op-eds, call up all your representatives and tell them that you want them to advocate for climate solutions.
Do we have questions from the floor?
There's one slide that showed the mosquitoes, and there's a couple of peaks in green, but I don't know what they were.
The question is this: there was one slide about mosquitoes, and it had some charts or points in green. What were they? Explain that. That's the question.
One represented the ticks. The ticks were the low ones that were red.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little
Mosquitoes are
bit
green?
further down. And the green ones represented the mosquitoes, the number of mosquitoes that increased.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
But that's a good question.
That's somebody paying attention. Way to go, Barry.
Yeah. Bottom line, they're both increasing, especially mosquitoes.
Other questions? With that, we'll thank our speakers very much. We appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time. And please work with us. We're on the same team trying to do something about climate change. This has been a priority of ours for several years. And so join with us and let's work together. Thank you very much.